Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Mark Davis had always been a man of principles. At 23, he was struggling to balance law school and a part-time job, all while managing the debts left behind by his late father. Life had never been easy for him, and as the pressure mounted, it felt like there was no way out. But everything changed the day he received an unexpected call. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Mark frowned. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he asked, feeling confused. "How do you know about my situation?" Eleanor's voice was calm, almost cold. "I know enough. Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important." Before Mark could protest, the line went dead. Who was this woman? How did she know about his financial struggles? And more importantly, why was she so interested in him? He didn't have much time to think. The clock was ticking, and he was running out of options. When Mark arrived at Brooks Bistro that evening, the rain was coming down hard, soaking him as he stepped inside. He quickly wiped the water from his jacket and looked around the cozy restaurant. At a corner table, a woman with silver hair sat, her presence commanding and elegant, yet her eyes held a hint of something deeper. "Mark," she greeted him, her voice smooth, almost formal. "Please, sit." He hesitated for a moment, taking in the luxurious surroundings, a stark contrast to his own life. His mind raced, still trying to make sense of the call. As he sat down, Eleanor wasted no time. Mark's heart skipped a beat. How could this woman, a stranger, know so much about his personal life? "What are you proposing?" he asked cautiously. Mark's jaw dropped in disbelief. "Marry you," he muttered, trying to process the offer. "But why me? We don't even know each other." Her gaze softened, though her tone remained steady. "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. You'll marry me for business, and in return, I'll clear your debts, secure your future, and provide you with the means to live the life you deserve." It was too good to pass up, and yet it felt so wrong. But Mark, desperate to escape the crushing weight of his debts, found himself torn. His pride told him to refuse, but his circumstances left him with few choices. He had never been the type to take shortcuts, but this was different. His mother's medical bills were piling up, his sister's tuition was overdue, and if he didn't act soon, he might lose everything. With a deep breath, Mark nodded. "I'll do it." Eleanor's smile was small, but it held a sense of finality. "Good. The arrangements will be made immediately." As Mark left the bistro that night, a strange feeling settled over him. He had agreed to a marriage that wasn't about love or affection. It was a contract, a transaction. And yet, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this would change his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Little did he know, this decision would lead him down a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and what it meant to truly live. As Mark left the bistro that night, he felt a mixture of disbelief and uncertainty. How could he have agreed to something so out of the ordinary? A marriage, a contract, and all of it had been sealed with a single, simple decision. He had no choice. His debts were mounting, and his family was depending on him. He had never been one to take shortcuts, but now, it seemed like his only option was to dive into a world he didn't fully understand. Eleanor had made it sound easy. She would take care of everything: his debts, his future, even his reputation, but the price was steep. A marriage of convenience. No love, no strings attached. It was all about business, or so she said. But a part of him couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this would lead to something more. The following day, Mark found himself back at the bistro, sitting across from Eleanor once again. She was as composed as ever, her sharp eyes assessing him with an almost calculating gaze. There was no hint of warmth in her demeanor, only business. "I trust you've had time to think it over," she said, her voice smooth, like silk. The arrangements will be made quickly. I'll have my lawyer prepare the necessary documents. All you need to do is sign. She pushed a set of papers across the table towards him. Mark hesitated. The papers in front of him felt like an anchor, holding him down, tying him to a future that wasn't his own. A future built on a lie. He didn't want tea, she never did. But the weight of his responsibilities pressed heavily on his shoulders. His mother's hospital bills, his sister's tuition, the looming threat of losing everything he had left. He glanced up at Eleanor, her eyes still fixed on him, waiting for him to make his move. "You're doing the right thing," she continued, as if reading his mind. "This deal benefits both of us. I need a husband to secure my legacy, and you need financial stability. Think of it as a temporary arrangement, a partnership that will give us both what we need. This is the best solution for you." Mark looked down at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. There was no turning back now. He signed his name, the pen scratching across the page, sealing the deal. "Good," Eleanor said, her smile tight but satisfied. "The wedding will take place next week. We'll have a small ceremony. No need for anything extravagant. Just the two of us, and a few close associates." She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'll have everything arranged." With that, she turned and walked out of the bistro, leaving Mark sitting there, his mind reeling. The days that followed were a blur. Mark found himself in a whirlwind of preparations. He wasn't sure what to expect from a marriage that was purely business, but Eleanor made it clear that there would be no emotional attachment. They would live their separate lives, keeping the charade up only when it was necessary. He spent the week in a daze, his thoughts consumed by the enormity of the decision he had made. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder what would it be like, living with her, even if it was all fake. On the night of the wedding, Mark stood in front of a grand, empty chapel. The space was elegant, yet cold, like everything else about this arrangement. Eleanor had insisted on a simple ceremony, and he respected that, but there was an emptiness that hung in the air. He was about to marry a woman he hardly knew, in front of a handful of people who were there only for the formality of it all. There would be no grand love story here, no passionate vows exchanged. Just a contract. A promise of financial security, with no strings attached. As the ceremony began, Mark stood beside Eleanor, his heart pounding in his chest. She was beautiful, poised, and graceful, everything he had expected. But there was something about her that felt distant. Cold, even. She wasn't here for love, she was here for something else entirely. And Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he, too, had become part of something bigger than he had ever imagined. A life he hadn't chosen, a future he hadn't planned. When it was time to say their vows, Mark felt a pang in his chest. He hadn't prepared any words, didn't know what to say. But as he looked at Eleanor, he realized that despite everything, the business arrangement, the coldness between them, couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility to this woman. She was his wife, after all, even if it was just on paper. "I vow to honor this contract," Mark said, his voice steady but lacking emotion. "To fulfill my part of the agreement, and to see this through, no matter what." It wasn't a vow of love, but it was a vow nonetheless. Eleanor's response was just as formal. "I vow to uphold my side of this arrangement," she said, her voice calm and measured. "This is a partnership, nothing more. We both stand to gain from this, and that's all that matters." The ceremony ended with a simple kiss, more out of obligation than affection. As Mark walked down the aisle, he couldn't help but feel like a man trapped in a story he didn't understand, unsure of where this path would lead. The wedding may have been over, but the real journey was just beginning. And little did he know, Eleanor's carefully constructed walls were about to crack, and the life they had set in motion would change everything for both of them. The following days after the wedding felt like a blur. Mark couldn't shake the unease that clung to him like a heavy fog. The marriage had been a simple affair, devoid of any real emotion, and now, as he sat in the grand penthouse Eleanor had arranged for them, he felt more isolated than ever. The room was luxurious, filled with sleek furniture and expensive artwork, but there was an emptiness that he couldn't ignore. He was living in a world that wasn't his own. It was all part of the deal, a cold, transactional arrangement. But still, he couldn't help but wonder, was there more to this than he had bargained for? The first few days in their new life together were quiet. Eleanor maintained her distance, as expected. They spent their time in separate areas of the penthouse, both busy with their own lives. Mark had no idea what she did during the day, and she never asked him about his. There was no real connection between them, just an understanding that they were living together for business purposes. And yet, every time their paths crossed in the halls or at the dinner table, something subtle shifted in the air. Mark found himself looking at her more than he should, noticing the way her eyes held a quiet strength, the way she moved with purpose, even in the smallest of gestures. One evening, after a long day of work, Mark found himself in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner for himself. He had grown used to the silence, to the routine of living alone, even though technically he wasn't alone. Just as he was about to sit down at the table, Eleanor walked in. She was dressed in a sharp black suit, her silver hair pulled back neatly, but there was something different about her tonight. She seemed more vulnerable. She glanced at him for a moment before sitting down across from him at the table. "I don't usually cook," she said, her voice soft, as though she was trying to make small talk. "But I thought I should make an effort tonight." There was a pause as she looked at the meal he had prepared. "It looks good." She smiled slightly, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimpse of something real in her eyes, something not entirely cold. Mark nodded, a little surprised by her attempt at normalcy. "It's nothing fancy. Just something to get by." He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You don't have to make an effort on my account. We're just living together for the sake of the contract, right?" He wanted to make it clear that there was no need for pleasantries between them. It was all business. But Eleanor didn't seem to mind. She sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "It's strange," she said after a beat. "Living in a house that doesn't feel like a home." Her words hung in the air, unspoken emotions behind them. "I've been alone for so long, Mark, and now, we're here, bound by a contract that means nothing but everything at the same time." She sighed, as if the weight of her own thoughts had finally caught up with her. Mark listened carefully, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to this side of her, the woman behind the powerful persona. It made him uncomfortable, but it also made him curious. What was she really thinking? What did she want from this arrangement? The silence between them grew heavy, and for the first time, Mark found himself wanting to break through the barriers they had both built around themselves. He cleared his throat, looking down at his plate before meeting her gaze. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "we don't have to pretend anymore. If this is going to work, we should at least be honest with each other." His voice was steady, but his words felt like a challenge, like he was testing the boundaries of their fragile connection. Eleanor's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Mark saw something vulnerable in her, something human. She took a deep breath and nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I agree," she said. "But I don't know where this is going, Mark. I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been. And right now, I'm not sure I want to find out." Her eyes locked with his, as if searching for something in his gaze. Mark didn't know what to say. The truth was, he didn't have any answers either. He was stuck in a marriage of convenience, one that he had never wanted, with a woman who seemed so far removed from the warmth of family and love. And yet, he couldn't help but feel a pull toward her. They were both trapped in this arrangement, but for some reason, he couldn't stop thinking that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than either of them realized. As the evening wore on, the silence between them grew less uncomfortable, and Mark found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He talked about his family, about the burden of debt, about his fear of losing everything. And Eleanor, in turn, spoke of her own struggles, the sacrifices she had made to get to where she was. For the first time, they shared something beyond the confines of their contract. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that night, as they both retreated to their separate rooms, Mark couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. It was a small step, but it was progress. He didn't know where this marriage would lead, but one thing was certain: this was no longer just a contract. It was something else, something he couldn't yet understand. And as he lay in bed, the sound of Eleanor's footsteps fading down the hall, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found a glimpse of something real in this complicated, messy life they were now living together. Days turned into weeks, and the arrangement between Mark and Eleanor settled into a strange rhythm. They shared the same roof but led separate lives, each bound by the unspoken rule of distance. Yet something had changed since that quiet dinner. The air between them felt softer, less mechanical, as if the walls they had built were beginning to crack. Mark started to notice small details about her, the way she paused before speaking, the tiredness that lingered in her eyes despite her perfect posture. And Eleanor began to see Mark not as a transaction, but as a man trying to find his place in a world that had been cruel to him. One morning, Mark woke to the sound of rain tapping against the glass windows. He found Eleanor standing by the balcony, her figure outlined against the gray sky. She was holding a cup of coffee, lost in thought. For a moment, he simply watched her, unsure whether to interrupt. Then he spoke quietly, "You're up early." She turned, startled, then offered a faint smile. "Old habits," she said. "I used to start every day like this, thinking about what I needed to control before the world got ahead of me." Mark leaned against the doorway, curious. "And now?" Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee before answering. "Now I realize I never really controlled anything. I just kept myself too busy to feel it." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. That morning conversation became a turning point. It was small, unplanned, but it marked the first time Eleanor had let her guard down. From then on, their days began to overlap in unexpected ways. She would join him for breakfast, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet conversation. When he worked late into the night, she would leave a cup of tea on his desk without a word, and when she returned from business meetings, exhausted and tense, he would greet her at the door with a few simple words that always seemed to ease her shoulders. "You're home." Neither of them spoke about it, but both felt the shift, an invisible thread drawing them closer together. It was during one of Eleanor's charity events that the world began to take notice of their unusual marriage. The press had expected it to fail, calling it a publicity stunt or a financial arrangement, but seeing them together that night told a different story. Eleanor, usually composed and distant, looked almost human as she stood beside Mark. He guided her through conversations, easing the tension in her expression with small jokes that made her laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. Cameras flashed, and whispers spread like wildfire. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They were no longer just partners in a contract, they were learning how to be partners in something deeper. After the event, they drove home in silence. The city lights blurred outside the car windows, reflecting against the glass like fleeting memories. Mark glanced at Eleanor, who seemed lost in thought. "You were amazing tonight," he said. She smiled faintly, her eyes soft. "You were the one who made it bearable. I haven't felt that alive in a long time." Her words caught him off guard. There was no calculation, no mask, just honesty. For the first time since their marriage began, Mark saw not the powerful CEO, but the woman underneath, the one who carried loneliness like an old friend. Later that night, Mark found Eleanor in the study, sitting at her desk surrounded by papers and photographs. He knocked softly. "You should rest," he said. She looked up, eyes distant, as if caught between worlds. "I cannot sleep," she murmured. "This house is too quiet." Mark hesitated before stepping inside. "It doesn't have to be," he said. "You just have to let it feel like home." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her gaze shifted. "And what if I have forgotten how to do that?" she asked. Mark smiled gently. "Then we can learn together." It was a simple promise, but it stayed with her. That night, Eleanor found herself replaying his words over and over. Somewhere between the silence and the rain outside, she realized that her carefully constructed world had begun to change. The walls she had built to keep others out were slowly being dismantled, not by force, but by kindness. Mark's kindness. He had entered her life as part of a deal, a means to an end, yet now she couldn't imagine the house without his quiet presence. As the days passed, their connection deepened. They shared dinners that turned into late-night conversations. They laughed more often, though neither of them would admit it. And though they still slept in separate rooms, the emotional distance between them was shrinking. Mark found himself caring in ways he hadn't expected, watching over her when she worked too late, leaving her notes when she skipped meals, and reminding her that there was more to life than control and contracts. Eleanor, in turn, began to trust again, something she thought she had lost forever. One evening, as they sat together watching the rain, Eleanor looked at him and said softly, "Do you ever think we made a mistake?" Mark turned to her, surprised. "A mistake?" She nodded. "Getting married like this. Out of desperation, not love." Mark thought for a moment before replying, maybe it was not love then. But maybe it can become something like it now. She looked at him, eyes glistening, and for the first time, she didn't look away. In that moment, neither of them said another word. They didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of their old lives. Inside, two souls bound by a contract began to find something real, something they never planned for, but something they both desperately needed. The days went by in a blur of unexpected moments, the kind that neither Mark nor Eleanor had ever planned for. The walls between them had continued to crumble, slowly at first, but with each passing day, it became harder to ignore the feelings that were growing between them. What had started as a business arrangement, a mere contract, now felt like something more, something they weren't prepared for. Mark couldn't deny the pull he felt every time Eleanor walked into a room, every time she looked at him with those soft eyes, as if she were finally seeing him as a person, not just a partner in a deal. But he knew the reality: they were still bound by the contract, by the agreement they had made. Still, the lines between what was fake and what was real had blurred, and neither of them knew how to navigate this new territory. It was late one evening when everything came to a head. Mark had been working late again, as he often did, trying to catch up on the mountain of paperwork that had piled up since his marriage to Eleanor. He was sitting in the study when he heard a soft knock at the door. It was Eleanor. She was standing in the doorway, looking as composed as ever, but there was something in her eyes, something different. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her expression serious. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice quieter than usual. Mark looked up from his papers, sensing the tension in the air. He set his pen down, giving her his full attention. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of concern. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her gaze drifting to the window, where the city lights shimmered in the distance. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice almost fragile. "About everything. About us." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Mark couldn't find the right thing to say. They had always danced around their feelings, never truly acknowledging the changes that had taken place between them. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, they couldn't avoid it any longer. Mark stood up and walked over to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Eleanor, whatever this is, we don't have to pretend anymore. We don't have to keep this up if it's not working." He was surprised at how vulnerable the words sounded coming out of his mouth. He wasn't used to feeling exposed, but with her, something had shifted. He felt the need to say it, to put it out in the open, even if it meant risking everything. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't want to pretend either," she said quietly. "But I'm scared, Mark. I've spent so much of my life protecting myself, building walls around me. I don't know how to let them down. And now, here we are, two people who are supposed to be married, but we're still strangers to each other. I'm scared that if I let myself feel something for you, it will ruin everything we've worked for." Her voice faltered slightly, and Mark could see the vulnerability she had been hiding behind her carefully crafted facade. Mark reached out, taking her hand gently in his. He could feel her hesitation, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he held her hand firmly, as if grounding them both in the reality of the moment. "We're already living in a lie," he said softly. "We've built this life on a contract, on something that wasn't real. But the truth is, I don't want to keep pretending anymore either. I want to know you, Eleanor. Not just the businesswoman, not just the woman in the contract. I want to know the person you are when no one's watching. And if that means taking a chance, then I'm willing to do it." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, her grip tightening on his hand. There was a long pause, a moment where neither of them knew what would come next. But in that silence, something shifted again. The walls that had been between them, built so carefully over the months, were crumbling, piece by piece. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never let anyone in, Mark. Not like this. But maybe I'm ready to try. Not for the contract, not for the agreement. But for us. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she smiled, not the cold, calculated smile of a CEO, but something softer, more genuine. Mark's heart swelled at her words. It wasn't a promise yet, but it was a step forward. It was more than he had ever hoped for, more than he had ever expected from this strange, unexpected marriage. In that moment, he realized that maybe love wasn't about perfect timing or grand gestures. Maybe it was about two people willing to take a chance on each other, despite all the odds. The night stretched on, and as they sat together, talking quietly, Mark knew that their journey was just beginning. It wouldn't be easy, and there would still be obstacles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. And maybe, just maybe, this marriage would turn out to be more than just a contract. Maybe it would become a love story after all. As the weeks went by, Mark and Eleanor began to settle into a new routine, one that was far from the cold, transactional arrangement they had once agreed to. They had found a fragile but undeniable connection, one that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something neither of them had expected. They started spending more time together, not just as a business arrangement, but as two people learning to coexist in a life that had been forced upon them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One evening, Eleanor suggested they go out for dinner, something simple, just the two of them. Mark was surprised but agreed, intrigued by the idea of spending time with her outside the walls of their home. As they sat in a quiet corner of a dimly lit restaurant, Mark couldn't help but notice how different she looked. Gone was the rigid, businesslike persona she wore in public tonight. Eleanor seemed relaxed, almost human, with her hair loosely tied back and no walls between them. They spoke freely, sharing stories about their lives, stories that, until now, had been kept hidden behind the masks they wore for the world. "You know, I never really understood the idea of happiness," Eleanor said, stirring her wine absent-mindedly. "I've always been so focused on control, on keeping everything in place. But recently I've been wondering if maybe happiness isn't about controlling everything. Maybe it's about letting go." She looked at Mark, her eyes thoughtful, as if she were trying to make sense of the words as they came out. Mark listened carefully, taking in her words. There was a vulnerability in her voice, one that she had never shown before. It was as if, for the first time, she was letting him see the person behind the powerful CEO, the woman who had spent so many years building walls around her emotions. "I think you're right," Mark said softly, his gaze steady. "Happiness isn't about control. It's about moments like this, being able to sit down, to talk, to actually connect without worrying about all the things we think we have to control." Eleanor smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Maybe that's why I've always kept people at arm's length," she admitted. "I didn't know how to let go, how to trust anyone with the real me. But you've made me see that maybe I don't have to keep everything locked away." Her voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but the weight of what had been shared lingered in the air. For the first time, Mark felt like he was seeing Eleanor not just as his wife, but as someone who was struggling, someone who had her own fears and insecurities, just like him. As they left the restaurant and walked through the quiet streets, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't love yet, but it was something close to it. There was no longer any pretense between them. They were simply two people, walking through life together, figuring things out as they went along. The following week, things began to change more quickly than Mark had expected. Eleanor, usually distant and focused on work, started making more of an effort to be present. She joined him for breakfast, even helped him pick out clothes for business meetings, and began to show a level of care he hadn't seen from her before. It was subtle, but it was there. And for Mark, it was enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something real to develop between them. But as their connection deepened, Mark couldn't help but feel the pressure building. They were still living in a marriage based on a contract. There was no denying that reality. As much as he wanted to believe in their growing bond, he couldn't escape the fact that they had started this journey under false pretenses. One night, after a long day of work, Mark came home to find Eleanor sitting on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. She didn't turn when he walked out, but he could sense the weight of her thoughts. "Eleanor," he called gently. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but distant. "About everything. About this marriage. About us." Her words hung in the air, and Mark's heart skipped a beat. Was she going to pull away again? Was this the moment everything fell apart? But to his surprise, Eleanor didn't pull away. Instead, she stood up and walked toward him. "I know we started this as a business deal. I know it was all supposed to be just a contract. But—" She stopped, looking up at him with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "But I'm starting to think it could be more. I'm starting to think that maybe this thing between us is real." She paused, as if gathering the courage to say what she really felt. "And I don't want to lose it." Her voice softened, and for the first time, Mark saw the vulnerability that had been hiding behind her powerful exterior. Mark stood there, taking in her words. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. This was what he had been waiting for, the moment when Eleanor finally acknowledged what they had. But was it too late? Was he ready to let go of the contract and take a leap of faith? He stepped closer to her, his heart racing. "I don't want to lose it either," he said, his voice low but steady. "I don't know where this is going, but I'm willing to find out with you." He reached out, taking her hand in his, and for the first time in their marriage, it felt like a promise not of a contract, but of something real. In that moment, they both understood that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. But it was one they would face together, without the walls they had built. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had planned, but both of them had been searching for. In the days that followed, Mark and Eleanor continued to navigate the complexities of their marriage. What had once felt like a contract now seemed to be something far deeper, something neither of them had expected. They had opened doors to each other they never thought they would, and with each passing day, they found themselves confronting feelings they had carefully avoided before. But as their bond grew, so did the complications. The truth of their arrangement, the foundation upon which everything had been built, still loomed over them like a shadow, threatening to tear apart the fragile connection they had formed. It was during one of Eleanor's high-profile business meetings that the tension reached its breaking point. Mark had attended, trying to support her in a way that went beyond the role of a husband in name only. He sat quietly at the back of the room, observing the interactions, the sharpness in Eleanor's voice as she commanded the room with ease. He admired her confidence, but there was also a sense of distance, as if she were holding a part of herself back from the world. She didn't look at him, not once, during the entire meeting, and it hurt more than he expected. After the meeting, Mark waited for Eleanor in her office. When she walked in, looking tired but composed, she didn't immediately acknowledge him. She went straight to her desk, her face hardening as she flipped through papers, her mind clearly elsewhere. Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Eleanor," he began softly, "are you okay?" His voice felt too quiet, too uncertain, but he needed to know. They had gotten so close, yet there were still walls between them, walls he didn't know how to tear down. She didn't look up at first, but then her shoulders slumped, and she finally met his gaze. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tired. It's hard, Mark. Everything is always so cold. I can never let my guard down. Not in business, not with anyone." She paused, her eyes searching his, as if looking for something she hadn't found yet. "And I'm afraid. Afraid that if I let myself care about you, it will all fall apart." Her voice cracked slightly, but she quickly regained control. Mark stood up and walked over to her, unsure of what to say. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the vulnerability she never allowed anyone to see. He placed his hand on hers gently, trying to bridge the distance between them. "I don't want you to be afraid, Eleanor," he said softly. "We've been through a lot, but we don't have to keep pretending. If this is real for you, if this is something worth fighting for, then I'm here. You don't have to do it alone." His words were simple, but they were the truth. He had been scared, too, but now, he wasn't afraid to take the next step, to go all in. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and the silence between them felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, Eleanor pulled her hand away and stood up, her eyes not quite meeting his. "I've never really let anyone in," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But maybe I'm starting to think I want to. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. She took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to say what she had been holding inside for so long. I'm scared, Mark, she admitted, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and hope. But I think I'm ready to try. Ready to let go of the walls I've built around myself. She looked at him, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. For us. For whatever this is between us. Her voice trembled slightly, but it was real. It was the first time she had fully acknowledged the possibility of something more than just an arrangement. Mark's heart swelled in his chest as he reached out to her, pulling her into an embrace. He didn't need to say anything, they both understood what had changed. In that moment, they both knew that whatever obstacles they faced, they would face them together. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were still many challenges ahead. But they had crossed a line that marked the end of their contract and the beginning of something new, something they would have to build together. As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of her office, the world outside seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, no contracts, no pretenses, no fear. Just two people, finally allowing themselves to feel the things they had been too afraid to admit. And for the first time, Mark believed that this, whatever this was, could be enough. In the days that followed, Mark and Eleanor found themselves in uncharted territory, navigating the complicated, fragile bond that had formed between them. The walls they had both built up over the years were slowly coming down, piece by piece. They spent more time together, not just as husband and wife, but as two people trying to understand one another beyond the confines of their contract. And while their connection was growing stronger, there was still a question lingering in the back of Mark's mind: was this real, or was it just the result of their shared circumstances? One evening, after a particularly long day, Mark found Eleanor sitting in the study, staring out the window at the city below. She was deep in thought, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her glass. Mark stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before stepping inside. "Hey," he said softly, unsure of how to approach her. She turned to him with a slight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She seemed distracted, distant in a way that he hadn't seen in a while. "Hey," she replied, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. "I was just thinking." She paused, looking at the glass in her hand. "About everything. About us. About what this really means." Her words hung in the air, and Mark felt the weight of them settle on his chest. He walked over to her, sitting down beside her. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice gentle but steady. "Is everything okay?" He didn't want to push her, but the uncertainty in her tone had him on edge. Eleanor sighed, setting the glass down on the table beside her. "I don't know. I keep wondering if this is real. This feeling I have for you. It's hard for me to tell, Mark. I've spent so many years keeping myself closed off, building walls around everything, around how I feel. And now that those walls are coming down, I don't know how to trust it. Trust myself." Her voice cracked slightly, and for the first time in a long time, Mark saw the raw vulnerability beneath her confident exterior. Mark reached for her hand, his grip firm but comforting. "I don't think either of us knows what this is yet," he said, his voice calm. "But I know I want to find out. I want to be here with you, to see where this goes, no matter what. We don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take it one step at a time." He squeezed her hand, a promise in his touch. She looked at him, her eyes searching his, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them. The weight of the contract they had entered into, the cold, businesslike foundation upon which their marriage had started, felt like a distant memory now. In its place was something new, something uncertain, but real. "I want that too," Eleanor whispered. "I want to believe in this. In us." She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "But I'm still scared, Mark. I'm scared that this might be too good to be true, that I'm just fooling myself into thinking that we could have something real." She looked away, as if trying to gather her thoughts. Mark gently turned her face back toward him, his eyes meeting hers. "It's okay to be scared," he said. "We're both scared. But that doesn't mean it's not real. It means we're being honest with ourselves, and that's all we can do." He smiled softly, his thumb brushing across her hand. We'll figure it out together. Whatever happens, we're in this together. His words, simple as they were, held a weight of sincerity that made Eleanor's heart swell. For a moment, Eleanor said nothing, just looked at him, her eyes filled with something Mark couldn't quite name. Then, slowly, she smiled a smile that was small but genuine. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for being patient with me." Mark leaned in, his heart racing as he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "You don't have to thank me," he murmured. "I'm here, Eleanor. I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, as they sat together in the quiet of the study, he felt the weight of his words. He was here, and for once, it wasn't just out of obligation or necessity. It was because he truly wanted to be. As the days passed, Mark and Eleanor continued to take those small steps forward, learning to navigate their relationship with the same care and vulnerability they had never allowed before. The contract that had once defined their lives together was slowly fading into the background, replaced by something far more powerful: trust, connection, and the possibility of something lasting. Neither of them knew where it would lead, but for the first time, they both felt ready to find out. The weeks that followed felt like a new chapter for Mark and Eleanor. The uncertainty that once hung between them had been replaced by something stronger and undeniable: connection. They weren't perfect, and they hadn't figured everything out, but they were learning to trust each other in a way neither of them had expected. Mark found himself looking at Eleanor differently now, not as the powerful CEO with walls built so high, but as a woman who had allowed herself to feel, to let someone in. And Eleanor, she had started to see Mark not just as a man who had helped her fulfill a contract, but as someone she could rely on, someone who could make her laugh, someone who truly cared. One evening, as they sat in the living room together, the soft glow of the fire casting a warm light across the room, Eleanor turned to Mark, her face serious but with a softness that had grown over time. "Mark," she began, her voice steady but with an underlying emotion that she had rarely allowed herself to show. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. I know we started this marriage as something pragmatic. A business arrangement, really. But I don't think I can keep pretending anymore. What we have, know it's real. And I'm not going to let fear stand in the way of it anymore." Mark looked at her, his heart beating a little faster. There was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment Eleanor finally admitted what they both had known for a while now. This was no longer just a contract. It was something that had grown into something deeper, something real. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice full of sincerity, "I never wanted just a business arrangement. From the very beginning, I wanted something more. I wanted to be with you, to know you, to be by your side. I don't care how we got here. I don't care about the contract. All I care about is that you're here with me now. And I'm not going anywhere." He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. She looked at him, her eyes full of warmth, and for the first time, there were no barriers between them. No walls. Just two people who had taken a chance on something they didn't fully understand, but had come to trust with everything they had. "I don't want to lose this, Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to lose us." She looked at him, her expression vulnerable but hopeful. "I never thought I would say this, but I think I'm ready. Ready to be with you. For real." Mark smiled, a smile that was equal parts relief and joy. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. "You don't have to worry about that," he said quietly, his lips brushing against her hair. "I'm not going anywhere." He meant every word. They had both come so far from where they started, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As they held each other, the weight of their past decisions seemed to melt away. The marriage that had begun as a contract, as a way to solve problems, had turned into something they both valued deeply. Something that wasn't about obligation, but about choice. The choice to be with each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Over the next few months, their relationship continued to grow stronger. They spent more time together, learning to navigate their lives side by side, not as business partners, but as partners in every sense of the word. They built a life together, one that was based on trust, respect, and love, something they had both come to realize was worth fighting for. Mark and Eleanor had started this journey as strangers, bound by contract. But they had finished it as something far more meaningful: a family. A true partnership, and for the first time, both of them believed in the possibility of forever, knowing that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together. In the end, it wasn't the contract that defined them. It was the love they had built, the trust they had earned, and the promise they had made to each other. And that was the greatest gift of all.